We're here today with Stephen Gibson, who's a social psychologist from York St John University. Welcome to the London Department. Thanks so much for agreeing to take part in this.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks for having me.
So, I think the first question I would ask you is how you got interested in rhetoric, in discourse, in language, but prior to your PhD.
Yeah, I did my undergraduate degree in psychology at Lancaster University, and I consider myself, particularly in retrospect, incredibly fortunate to have been there at a time when there was some fabulous social psychologists there, people like Susan Condor, John Dixon, Mark Levine, Jackie Abel came along a little bit later. We even had the late John Shotter came along for a year as well, I think in the final year of my undergraduate degree. And I can't remember the particular moment, and we reconstruct these things post hoc anyway, don't we? But I remember doing a course that John Dixon ran in the second year of my undergraduate degree on social psychology and language, and came across discursive and rhetorical approaches there, and subsequently, I think somehow I think through my interest in nationalism and national identity, I came across Mick Billig's wonderful book Banal Nationalism, which I read, and then I remember reading Arguing and Thinking after that, and around the same time I realised we had Susan Condor in the department, who I don't think taught me in the first 2 years of my degree, but I realised she'd done this work on national identity, so I sought her out and asked if she'd supervise my undergraduate dissertation, which had a bit of discourse analysis in there, and some ropey analysis of variance as well, if I remember rightly. But yeah, it kind of gradually sort of piqued my interest, and it was really, as with so many things in life, if one has wonderful teachers and supervisors, then it can really kind of bring these things to life.
Yeah, and you studied for your PhD at Lancaster, and you had Susan Condor and Jackie Abel as your supervisors, and you saying you became interested in citizenship and national identity. I wonder if you could talk a bit about your PhD and how the focus on citizenship and identity was.
Well, at the time of the PhD, it was very much national identity rather than citizenship. The citizenship aspect came a little later. So I was very much interested at the time in national identity and nationalism. Again, kind of stemming from reading Billig's book and those sort of initial contacts with Susan when she supervised me as an undergraduate. And as I say, I liked it so much I stuck around for a master's and a PhD, and at the time Susan was right in the midst of doing a lot of great work on specifically on English national identity at the time, and using that to make various really important points, not only at the sort of general literature on nationalism and national identity, but also around the social psychological literature on social identity, and trying to challenge the idea that that national identity is necessarily a kind of populated social category, and sort of expanding the purview of how we understand that. So my own particular take on that was to look for examples, and one example in particular of a sample group, if you like, where we might expect people to orient unproblematically to national identity, because a lot of Susan's work was showing that English people in particular sort of distanced themselves from any idea that they were patriotic or what have you. So I ended up interviewing soldiers serving military personnel on the kind of the starting assumption that surely they'll give accounts of military service that involve patriotism and serving their country, and lo and behold, it was a little more complicated than that.
Yeah. And so this interest in citizenship and national identity was influential after you graduated, and you've authored many publications in this area of research. I wonder if you could maybe talk about your work post-PhD in this area.
Yeah, so I did, and again, it was a move that Susan made from national identity towards looking more broadly at the idea of citizenship, which is a concept which, although there is a kind of history to it within the discipline, psychology has tended to leave citizenship to political science and social policy and what have you. So Susan started looking at citizenship from a broadly sort of rhetorical, ideological dilemmas perspective, looking at how people manage, for example, the dilemma between passive liberal citizenship and notions of active citizenship that were particularly they were being popularised at the time through the Blair government and the kind of responsibilisation agenda and things like that. One of the twists that I then started to develop after my PhD was to think particularly around that aspect of citizenship, sometimes called social citizenship, so welfare, that sort of thing. And trying to bring to bear broadly the tools of discursive and rhetorical psychology to look at how people talk about rights and responsibilities around welfare, unemployment benefits, and so on. And actually, one of the things that I unpacked was the psychological, the common sense psychological assumptions that underpin some of that around the kind of responsibility to be making an effort. So there's a lot of work in social policy around the kind of, particularly at the time under the New Labour policies, but I think it's been continued since, about the sort of preeminence of paid work as the ultimate citizenship responsibility. But I think kind of at an ideological level it goes deeper than that, that actually the ultimate citizenship responsibility is to be seen to be effortful, whether that's in engaging in paid labour or making the effort to search for work when one finds oneself unemployed, and actually that can be used to hold people to account and to kind of paint people in quite an unfavourable light. So I was interested in kind of unpacking and to a certain extent deconstructing some of those what you might call stereotypes around welfare claimants.
That's interesting. If I could just delve in a little bit deeper into peace psychology, because you've done a lot of work with peace and conflict, the armed forces. So I wondered if you say specifically more of your work in this area and its relation to social psychology.
Yeah, well, peace psychology is a really interesting area, and I don't think in the UK, I don't think there's a huge tradition of peace psychology. It's something which is very much sort of a North American endeavour, which I may be kind of painting with too broad a brush here, but it's kind of related to the sort of 60s, kind of that moment of people kind of perhaps in the States moving from not questioning the government to kind of, the Vietnam, there was the civil rights movement as well, people starting to want to hold the government to account. So there is, we talk about critical social psychology, there's a critical agenda to peace psychology in that it's wearing its politics on its heart. It's kind of saying psychology should be undertaken for peaceful means. But where I depart from peace psychology, and I don't think I would ever kind of describe myself as a peace psychologist as such, is that although politically peace psychology is quite critical, albeit from a broadly sort of liberal humanist perspective, in terms of its engagement with psychology, it's not as critical as I would want it to be. It's basically the sort of adaptation of, again, rather loosely we might call sort of mainstream techniques of things like attitude measurement and applying that for the sort of particular political ends. And while those ends may be perfectly laudable and things we will want to kind of foster and encourage in some respects, for me they're inseparable from the critique of some of the sort of individualist assumptions that are embodied within the sort of measurement technologies. So some of the things that I've done with in an attempt to engage with peace psychology has been to look at attitudes, if you like, to war, and do, again, not startlingly revolutionary or anything for a discursive psychologist, the standard sort of Potter and Weatherall twist on attitude is saying, well, rather than going out and measuring attitudes to war, let's look at what people do and how they evaluate things in talk. So I looked, for example, at the media debate around the invasion of Iraq in early 2003, and I had a whole bunch of data from the TV show Question Time with politicians and other commentators arguing, is it the right thing to go to war? Is it not? And one of the things that you see in the attitude literature within peace psychology is a correlation between attitudes to war and attitudes to any specific war. So I don't know off the top of my head, if you're kind of generally inclined to see war as a reasonable solution to foreign policy problems, then you're also likely to favour war in Iraq or Afghanistan or whatever the conflict it might be at the time. But what you find discursively in the data I was looking at is that actually people orient to that correlation and treat it as problematic because when we think of stake and interest, if you're seen to be arguing in favour of a specific war on the basis of a kind of general disposition to favour war, that's something you need to work to try and unpick. So you get, it's the classic kind of disclaimer, like, I'm not racist, I'm not sexist, I'm not a warmonger, but here's all the reasons, very reluctantly and very kind of carefully, and with all due respect for the possibility, and we must be absolutely only targeting military targets, but we have to take some military action. Again, military action, not war.
Sure. Fascinating. So if I could just switch slightly, maybe not so much. In recent years, you've been doing some fascinating work on Stanley Milgram's famous obedience experiments, or infamous rather. And I wonder if I could really just ask you how you got into this type of work. How did you access the original recordings, for instance?
Yeah. So, it's been absolutely fascinating and quite a departure from some of the other stuff that I've done. Although, as you kind of hinting there, in some respects, not too much of a departure. Way back when I did my PhD and I was looking at military personnel, I remember at the time, I think it was my master's thesis, I had a section on how people dealt with the issue of just having to follow the orders of, at the time, quite a controversial war, and people were distancing themselves from the Blair government and saying, that's for the politicians, I just do as I'm told. So if you want, again, post-talk, I can see the kind of the seeds of these things. But actually looking at the material itself, that came actually from teaching. And it's one of those lovely kind of examples where, in academia we often think about the kind of disconnect sometimes between teaching and research, but actually I realised that my Milgram lectures needed a bit of sort of spicing up after a couple of years of doing the standard story of Milgram. So I read Thomas Blass's biography of Milgram, a wonderful book, and I'd recommend to anybody who's interested in the obedience experiment. And in that book there was somewhere kind of tucked away in a footnote or something, some mention of these archives and the fact that there was a whole bunch of audio recordings there, but that nobody had ever really done anything, or not a great deal, with them. And I thought to myself, well, that sounds like an interesting possibility. So I applied for a small grant, which eventually was fortunate enough to get some money to purchase some copies of these recordings, and was quite amazed really. There's hundreds and hundreds of recordings there, and although in the last decade more and more people have got into this archive and started doing things with it, there's still a lot more that's not explored than is explored. So I kind of really saw this as a way of moving us away from that kind. We in psychology, the headline findings of 65% of people obey the experimenter, but I was interested. Well, what actually happened? How did it unfold? Initially, actually, my interest was in relatively straightforwardly in how the defiant participants resisted, partly on the grounds that we call them the obedience experiments. We're used to this message of overwhelming obedience. I was interested in how those significant minority of participants got themselves out. But it very quickly became apparent to me when I listened to the tapes that the story is not just about the participants, the story is also about the experimenter and how the standardised prods, the orders that the experimenter is issuing to try and keep them in there, administering the shocks, how those are tailored flexibly to the situation. So as much as there's a discursive psychology story in there, there's almost like a sociology of scientific knowledge story to be told there about the contingencies of standardisation. But as I said, there are many other stories as well waiting to be told based on those data.
Yeah. And has there been a reaction from kind of mainstream psychology to your work in particular?
Yeah, I think broadly speaking, it's been a fairly positive reaction, and I think that's born out of a couple of things. I think that firstly is that although I'm looking at the interactions and developing a sort of rhetorical discursive approach, there are other people who are also looking at material from those archives, not conceptually, methodologically doing the same things, although some are. There's Matthew Holland's work using conversation analysis as well, but there's a bunch of other people doing all kinds of stuff, and in one sense there's a critical mass of people who are challenging that standard story of the Milgram experiments in one way or another, and it's actually very difficult for people to ignore that. So gradually that standard story that has crystallised over 50 years about Milgram's experiments is beginning to be chipped away on. That's certainly not just my work. There's a bunch of people, Steve Reicher, Alex Hassan, Gina Perry, Ian Nicholson, Catherine Millard, all approaching it from their own theoretical lenses. Certainly not all psychologists either. But it's beginning very, very kind of slowly to chip away at that standard story of Milgram. But there's still a long way to go. I think still most textbook accounts give the usual story.
Sure. I recall some time ago you gave a very interesting talk at DARG about experimental prods. I just wondered if you've been to DARG a few times. I wonder if you could talk a bit about your experiences at DARG and in the department.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, it's interesting because being a product of Lancaster, Loughborough was always a place that, in some respect, we look to. Obviously, it's been the centre of discursive psychology for some decades now, but it was also a place where we saw as potentially orienting away from social psychology in some respects, and I think that's kind of, again, it may be a kind of rather broad brushed characterisation of DARG and of the Loughborough department in recent years, but I think some of the people there would probably accept that they've kind of oriented more towards a different audience. I've always wanted to kind of speak to social psychology as well. Who knows, I may change my views on this as I kind of come up against brick walls and what have you. I understand the reasons why these things have happened, but my experiences of DARG and my kind of the kind of impression that I've got of DARG over the years is of that kind of rich intellectual tradition of challenging and of critiquing the sort of assumptions which are just built into the apparatus of psychology as a discipline, and it's incredibly difficult to chip away at that. I talk about how difficult it is to chip away at the standard story of Milgram, but the assumptions built into psychology as a discipline, that's a whole other story, isn't it? But I think that tradition of discursive psychological work and of rhetorical work that has emerged from, is associated with DARG and with the Loughborough department over the years, has always been something that has been a kind of key touchstone for me, and it was kind of, and again to the extent to which I've I have my own kind of take or approach or perspective on things. I am always mindful of Mick Billig's suggesting that we shouldn't have a perspective, but I've always, like I said, I was reading Billig's work in combination with the kind of the more sort of personal interactions I was privileged to have with the folks at Lancaster, which really kind of switched me on to this different way of doing things. I always feel like it's been that kind of, I don't know, dialectic, you know what I mean? It's that kind of looking to the work that's come out of here, whilst also maintaining a foot in at least one other camp, I suppose. Yeah.
So just moving away from here and to your work you're doing at York St John, you're teaching on undergrad and postgrad modules, and you're also supervising some research students. I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about your work there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So we do have a reasonable presence for sort of discursive and more critical approaches in our undergraduate degree. We had a master's course at one point which, for various reasons, didn't really take off. But I think we have that in common with Loughborough as well. I think it's master's courses, I think, for all sorts of reasons, are quite challenging to run, and universities these days are more and more about the bottom line. So having 4 or 5 students a year doesn't necessarily cut the mustard in a way that we might like the idea of having a small group like that, but it may not be possible. But in terms of research students, I think again is something that at York St John at the moment we're trying to build up that side of things, taking on more like graduate teaching assistants and things like that, and trying to develop again. Exactly what it turns into will depend on how it grows and who is there and who joined us. But it's certainly something that we're beginning to try and develop as at least one aspect of what psychology is at York St John. We have very, very good experimental cognitive psychologists, developmentalists, some wonderful applied work there as well, beginnings of counselling psychology also. We're starting up a doctorate there. But in addition to that, it's something that we're hoping to develop and try and get that tradition of work which is maybe more critical, discursively orientated, sort of reasonably firmly established in the fabric of the institution, as much as any of us can do that these days.
Okay.
Yeah.
So just looking ahead now, I wonder if you could share with us any future research plans you might be having.
Yeah, I think it's I've got lots of plans. It's finding the time to do that. I think everybody's in the same boat in that respect. So as I said, there's a load of stuff to do on Miligram, and there was a time when I was kind of not sure whether I wanted to be the person to kind of keep doing that, and whether it was something like, there's a career's worth of material, there's several careers worth of material there, but I'm kind of thinking actually it's just too interesting not to kind of bite the bullet and go for. So I'm continuing to analyse the data from Milgram's experiments, also trying to develop the sort of critical engagement with peace psychology a little more, and try and find ways of getting that message across to the largely North American peace psychology audience as well. So in the same way that we have discursive social psychology, I think recently there's been inroads into like political psychology from discursive approaches. I think in health psychology there's a reasonable tradition of discursive work now. I think that there's an argument for kind of saying that peace psychology can be enriched, so I'm trying to find ways of doing that as well. I think are worth doing, and then also developing again, I'm not sure how much of a development of the national identity citizenship work it is, but I guess like many of us, the whole kind of dynamics around Brexit, whether you want to or not, you can't escape it. So again, with a couple of students and with a colleague at York St John, Mirko Damasi, who was a Loughborough PhD, we're also beginning to explore a few issues around how the Brexit debates are unfolding. Whether it has a kind of identity categorisation lens, that may just be one part of the story. I think again it's like anything, you have to pick off a manageable sort of chunk to actually make a reasonable contribution, because there's a heck of a lot that could be said about it. But yeah, that's kind of broadly the 3 strands of work that I've got on the go at the moment.
And lastly, a slightly more reflective question. From your research and from your experience, what do you think that discursive and rhetorical approaches to psychology can offer that maybe mainstream psychology can't?
Well, I think for me it is that engagement with how things happen. And I think in psychology there's a lot of great psychology, and it's absolutely not the aim of certainly what I'm doing to try and say that that's all wrong, it all needs to stop. But I think what psychology historically has not been very good at is dealing with social situations as social situations. And I think the discursive and rhetorical perspectives provide a unique and incredibly analytically fruitful way in which we can approach the social within social psychology, and much more broadly than that as well, because I do very much believe in the idea that, you know, all psychology really is social psychology, in the sense that we need, even if we're looking at the most basic sort of experimental research on perceptual processes, for example, that takes place in a social situation, and I do think that that's one area which, you know, with my kind of sort of Milgram hat on, I think, you know, it's a fabulous resource to have from the Milgram experiments, and it changes how we view those experiments. I think it would be fascinating to have recordings of other psychology experiments and see how they unfold. And that's not, you know, again, it's not about kind of saying that that's all wrong, but it's kind of saying, well, at a more subtle, more nuanced level, how is this stuff produced? And it actually, for me, enriches the phenomena that psychologists try to get a handle on, much more than it, you know, tries to knock it down or what have you.
Thank you. Great.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Brilliant, actually. Thanks very much.